All right, so trains. They are a essential part of moving logistics around in war. Even today, trains are incredibly important. Well, 20 years ago, you could still airdrop stuff, so you can supply your men anywhere. In the Vietnam War, you could airdrop stuff, but it took a little bit more effort. In World War II, you couldn't really airdrop stuff to supply a large army. So you really relied on ports and railroads, but there were also trucks that were reliable enough that you could supply your men pretty much anywhere. Well, in World War I, the trucks aren't that reliable yet, and there's not a whole lot of them, and there's not a lot of people that know how to drive them. So you have to rely extensively on railroads in port cities. So a lot of the fighting was concentrated around that, but you could also supply your men away from those railroads because there were enough trucks. Well, in the American Civil War, there were no trucks yet. You had horses, and you had trains, and you had ports. So it was vitally important that you controlled all of these things. Well, during the war, this is the first time trains have become a major part of combat. Trains existed beforehand, but they were not strong enough, powerful enough, and the railroads were not connected enough to really make any major difference in war. So before the Civil War, most of the fighting in most wars was condensed to major cities and then ports, because that's where you can supply your men. Or you take a smaller amount of men and they can live off of the land. But the railroads can change that. Now you can have fighting inland anywhere there's a railroad. And these roads that have trains on them, railroads, become little miniature railways for good reason, because they are that extremely important. Well, super handy dandy drawing to help show why these railroads are so important. So, let's say that you want to fight in this box right here. Well, if you have a river on this side, with river boats, you can supply your men off the river, which means that you can constantly have your men supplied. And your men can go 1 or 2 days with the food and stuff they have on their backs. So you can fight all the way to about here on the box. So you can fight here and be perfectly supplied, and everything is just A-okay. But if you want to take this, you have to stock up on extra supplies to get out here. So now you have an entire army that is bogged down by all the extra weight from food, materials, ammo, and it takes a lot to get an army of any substantial size out here. But let's say you have a train, and there's a train depot that sits in the same city right here. Well, if you control that city, well, suddenly you can go this amount of distance any which direction, because this river has the same function as this city if it has a railroad from it. So now you can take over anything in this box within 1 or 2 days. So now you're not just confined to the coast, you can go anywhere you want as long as there's a railroad that can accommodate that. So railroads become this incredibly important part of the Civil War, and it's found out to be that they are extremely important. So you have entire battles that exist solely over either railroad connections or just straight railways, not even just hubs, just railways. And battles are decided on who can get more men to the front the fastest. And it's really fascinating to look at. So that's what today's episode is on. Now, this image on the screen here shows what the rail network looked like in 1861. And this is not a fully comprehensive map either. There are smaller railroads that branch off of these railroads, and there's smaller railroads that don't connect to anything, just themselves. So take this map with a little bit of a grain of salt. But roughly 30,000 miles of railroad tracks exist at the start of the Civil War. Now, 21,000 miles of this belong to the Union, and only 9,000 belong to the South. So you hear this number and you think immediately, okay, well, obviously the North has the better rail network because they have more rail. However, Southern rails are built a lot more recently. So they have more technology in them. They're built with sturdier techniques, right? Right? No, That's the only thing that the South has going for them with their railroads for the entirety of the war, is the fact that their railroads are newer. They were made with worse materials. They are made with less trains. They connect to less. They cover less ground. Like, truly, the South was just having a horrible, horrible time with their rail networks. Now, also on the screen is different types of rail gauges. When you talk about rail gauges, you are referring to the width of the two rails between each other. Now, you have narrower gauges for lighter trains, right? And then you have narrow and meter gauges for, metro trains and stuff along that lines. And then you have wider gauges for, freight trains and passenger trains. You cannot take any old metro train and put it on a standard freight train track because the width is different. The gauges are different. Now, the South really goes through the ringer during the war because their gauges were not standardized. In the northern states, you have two major companies that are really taking over most of the railroads, and they build everything in a standard gauge. Now, you would also see a second type of gauge, but that wasn't super widespread. So everything is mostly in one gauge. Well, in the South, because they believe in protecting states' rights and the state should have everything up to them, you would see several different gauges. You have 10 different companies, and each one of them uses a different gauge that fits their company better. So if you were on the border of Georgia and South Carolina, and you have 4,000 men on a train, you would have to get off the train in Georgia, walk 10 feet into South Carolina, unload everything, and then reload onto the new train in South Carolina and continue moving. And you'd have to repeat that every single time the rail gauge changes, which would happen a lot. The city of Richmond had over 5 different gauges leading into it. So every single direction is a different gauge, and you would have to unload and reload every single time, which significantly slows down who you can move and what you can move. Because again, if you have a smaller gauge, you're not going to be able to get as much around. So really kind of shot themselves in the foot there, trying to protect states' rights and private companies' rights. And we're going to loop back to them later too. But this is just the tip of the iceberg of how bad the South had it when it came to their supply lines. Now, on the screen here is General Daniel McCallum and General Herman Haupt. These two were just regular railroad employees before the war. And then at the outbreak of the war, you have Lincoln and a bunch of other people come together and they say, hey, railroads are really helpful and they can supply everything we need very quickly. We can get something from Indiana to Virginia in 3 days. That's record-breaking fast. So we should use this for military usage. But if we just leave it up to the generals to command the trains, it's going to be chaotic and nobody's going to have enough trains and it's going to be chaos. So we are going to make a new part of the army that is going to control all of the railroads and trains on it. And we're going to call it the United States Military Railroads. For the rest of this video, I'll be referring to that as USMR, because I don't want to say United States Military Railroads every single time. So USMR comes out, and these two are the ones leading it. Now, on paper, they can control any and all railways in the North, and they can control any trains they need. In practice, they did not do that. In practice, they controlled more so just the railroads closest to the battlefields, and then as many trains they needed. But then their big thing was that they were in charge of building new railroads, repairing railroads, and then any and all captured railroads from the South would fall under their command. By the war's end, they had thousands of workers. They also gained control of 2,000 miles of captured and rebuilt and made railways, plus a significant amount of bridges. This is when bridges are actually pretty hard to make because you don't have all the crazy equipment. So they also end the war with 400 plus locomotives. Now, most of those were bought. Most of those were built in the North. But over 100 of them were either taken from the South because the South left them behind, or flat out stolen. And we're going to cover that in a minute too. They also end the war with thousands of train cars to go with them. I mean, these two make one of the most effective parts of the army just because they know a lot about rail, and the South failed to utilize just how effective rails were. Now, These two are also just two guys that could not care less about anybody else. They answered to the Secretary of the Army and they answered to the President. And other than those two, they didn't answer to anybody else. Several different times you had generals come up to these two and say, I need a train. Give me a train. I need to transport my troops. And they would say, nope, these are my trains. And repeatedly shut them down because they had control of the trains and they weren't going to divert a train just for a general to move his troops around unless there was an actual reason to do so. And they would shut them down all the time. Now, they also got wildly accurate with timetables. This image on the bottom here is a military train carrying troops. On one railroad by Richmond late in the war, there were 18 trains a day rolling up and down it. This isn't a normal road where you can just move around the train. If one train is on the tracks going north, you can't have another train going south. So 18 trains a day means that as soon as that train clears the track, there's a second train immediately going the opposite direction. And the second that train clears the track, there's another train going the opposite direction. I mean, they got incredibly accurate and they really enhanced and made these railroads as good as humanly possible. And it's one of the main reasons as to why the North won, was because one, they were industrialized, two, they had all the people they needed, and three, the logistics behind the North was insane. You can have as many people as you want. You can have all the crazy weapons, but if you don't have the logistics to back it up, you are going to lose. And the North realized this, and because of the rail networks that we had, really helped us win the war faster than if we hadn't had this. Now, this is kind of a fun thing to think about. Usmer could make a bridge with a railroad on top of it faster than the Confederates could lay 100 miles of new rail. And that's not because Usmer could make a bridge overnight. That's because the Confederates were that bad. That shockingly bad. So we already talked about the gauge issues in the South at the beginning of the war. But they had a bunch of other issues as well. So at the start of the war, they realized this gauge issue and they try to remedy it, but they can't because they don't have the materials. Keep in mind, the South was an agricultural area at the time. They produced cotton, they produced soybeans, they produced rice. They do not produce raw iron or coal or anything like that. So they can't remedy the gauge issues. So for the entire war, they are plagued by these gauge issues left and right. Also, the rail was made out of an inferior type of iron. The North has very hard iron that makes up these rails. So when they start loading up these trains with military troops and their equipment, and they are significantly heavier than usual, the rails can withstand that. In the South, lines would start warping and bending, and in some places they would fracture due to the weight of these trains, which would then lead to massive amounts of derailments because they couldn't replace the rail lines. It's insane. Now, throughout the war, they would try multiple times to make their own version of Usmer. Jefferson Davis realizes that the North has a good idea and that they need to make the railways, part of the military so they can move their troops around as fast as possible. And he comes to the Confederate Congress and he says, guys, we need an Usmer. And they tell him, no. Because if they make an Usmer, then that would take away from state rights, and that would take away from the private companies, so they can't have that. And it's not until 1865, a couple months before the war ends, that Jefferson Davis gets his own Usmer, but by that time, they don't have any railways left. They don't have any, because they are all destroyed, because they can't make any new rail lines. Now, another thing that really screwed the Confederates over is that they believed that the civilians came before the war effort. So while the North is, stopping trains so they can load them up with military equipment and delaying, civilian train schedules so a military train can get through, the South just has passenger trains rolling along and holding up military trains because civilians are more important than winning the war. So that leads to not enough equipment being moved via train, so they have to go by foot, and that just takes forever. And it's just insane how badly the Confederates fumbled the ball when it came to railway logistics in the Civil War. Now, this image on the screen here is of the Treasure Factory near Richmond, Virginia. And you can see in this image here that there's a cannon out front. This factory produced most of the naval cannons that the South would use during the war. Now, this is also the same factory where they would make railroad spikes before the war. Except when the war broke out, they decided that they don't need railroad spikes, they need cannons. Because cannons, shoot things and they kill people, and they're going to need that more than they're going to need railroad spikes. So we don't need to make those. But that meant that any time that a railroad spike broke or warped or was destroyed, they couldn't replace it because they weren't making any more railroad spikes because cannons are more important. Now, at the same time, they have a small little stockpile of rails to fix their railways. Except those get stolen and acquisitioned and taken so they can build ships because they need ironclad ships more than they need rails, obviously. So by 1865, they literally don't have rail lines anymore in most places because they haven't been able to replace them for years now because they don't want to make railroad spikes. They want cannons. They don't want to make railways. They want to make ships. But this means that while the Navy is doing fine, your army isn't because they aren't being supplied well enough. Logistics wins wars, not cannons. But they didn't see this. Also, at no point during the war were they ever able to make a significant amount of trains or cars. The North can pump out trains as much as they want. They made almost 300 trains throughout the war. They came out with a net positive of 400 trains. The South didn't come out with a net positive at all. In fact, they lost almost all of their trains because when one gets stolen or when one gets destroyed, they can't make another. But they can give you cotton. They just can't make more trains. Now, the other thing is that the South only can move stuff via land. Because while they're trying to make this big, beautiful Navy, the Union Navy is currently blockading them with the Anaconda Plan. And that means that anytime they put something on a boat, they risk that boat being seized by the Union and then losing all the equipment on that boat. So they only rely on land movement, which just takes forever. And they lose so much equipment because when they're retreating, they can't move it fast enough. Or when they're trying to get to a battle, they can't get there fast enough. Not to say that the Confederacy didn't have moments where railways helped them. During the battles of Chickasaw and the First Bull Run, they beat the Union pretty much entirely because the Union didn't expect them to bring up as many troops as they did. During the First Battle of Bull Run, you see multiple divisions of troops get moved up via rail from the south, and the Union gets caught completely off guard, and they get attacked by a force much larger than they thought, so they have to retreat and run away. During the Battle of Chickasaw, the Union attacks this very underprotected flank, except the Confederates managed to sneak in 12,000 troops via rail from the far side of the southern nation and managed to turn the tide of the battle. Now, by 1865, you don't see this happening because they don't have rail networks, but early on in the war, you can see these crazy saves and massive wins in battles because they have the rail network to support it. And really, after the Civil War, you start seeing railways really start to blossom and become these massive, important things in war. I mean, during World War II, we had entire bombing campaigns that were solely taken against railway networks because they are that important. Even today, rail networks are highly, highly important. With as much cargo as you can put on the biggest cargo plane in the military, you can put multiple times more on a train. They are incredible workhorses, and they truly do win wars if used correctly. But the South never got to utilize it. So, during the war, if you could not directly capture the railroad because it's either too far behind enemy lines or you don't have the means of getting to it, you could go do a sabotage campaign. If I can't have it, then they can't have it. And these sabotage campaigns were effective, extremely effective, on both sides throughout the war. Now, this image here is a locomotive, and there's 3 people chasing it, and there's burning train cars under a bridge in the back. This stems from the most Looney Tunes chase I think I have ever heard of in any war from any time period. Basically, the Andrews Raid was a mix of Union soldiers and civilians going down into Georgia, stealing a locomotive and 3 cars and taking it on a 90-mile, 7-hour-long goose chase while being chased down by 3 Confederate locomotives just to see, 1, if they could, and 2, if they could destroy railway lines and telegraph lines along the way. And while their overall mission was not completed, they didn't do as much damage as they hoped, it was just kind of funny that, like, well, a group of Union soldiers stole your train car, dude. They ran off with it. Let's go chase them down. And they distracted the Confederates and took away 4 locomotives for the span of like a day. Now, they were caught because the train did run out of fuel, and most of them were executed. But this is also where you see the first Medal of Honors given out to some of the guys on this chase. Now, while this one wasn't particularly effective, both sides had much more effective sabotage campaigns throughout the war. The B&O Railroad was the beating heart of the nation before the war. I mean, it is this incredibly important railroad, and during the war becomes one of the biggest targets for sabotaging campaigns from the South. It goes through over 150 different raids throughout the war, and just an incredible amount of monetary damage comes upon this railway. Except the North has the iron to replace it, it has the wood to replace it, so it's more of a nuisance, really. Like, the train derailed, fix it, fix the railway, and we just had a week-long delay. And that did work. It was effective. It slowed down the North. But when the South does the same thing, it turns out a lot worse. When Sherman makes his march to the sea, their 60-mile wide path where they burnt down anything in their path, the railroads they destroyed were never able to be rebuilt because they never had the materials. So while they destroy the North railroads, it's a nuisance. We destroyed their railroads in the South, and they are crippled. They cannot come back from it. Sherman, as he's marching along, destroys every bit of cotton, every supply depot, every railway. And as they're walking around, they are making Sherman's neckties, which is a little haunting. But they would rip up the rails, heat them up, and then twist them around trees. Meaning that no matter what you do, you can never use that rail again because it will never be straight enough to use for a train. So you would have to take the rail and then you would have to smelt it down and then you'd have to rebuild it. But the South can't do that because cannons are more important. Now, this is wildly effective. And by 1865, they literally have no railroads left. Usmer is coming in and they have to rebuild every bit of railroad that they capture because the South just couldn't supply their troops like that, and every time they lost something, it really did hurt them. And it's absolutely insane. Logistics really does win war. Trains win wars, not cannons and ships. Now, there is one more thing I'd like to talk about, and that is other uses for the railroad. Railroads are used for more than just logistics. You can use them for a ton of different things. And the Civil War is the first time that you see like proof of concepts being used that would then be used in later wars. So this first image here is of an armored train, a very early armored train. And it has 5 cannons on it. And basically the whole point is if somebody comes to try and rob this train, we can hurt them. And if we really need to, in the middle of a battle, we can run this train into the middle of the battle, and then we'll have an armored firing area with 5 cannons, and, we can really put the hurt on the enemy. And it works. It definitely does the job that it needs to, but it's not super effective. Like, it doesn't change the war for anybody. And really, if you're confident enough to bring up a train into the middle of the battlefield, then you've pretty much won it anyway. Or you have the, supply that you can use a train like this, and you're not super worried if you lose it. Now, again, it's really just a proof of concept. During the First World War, you would see armored trains being used a lot more, famously against Lawrence of Arabia in the Middle East. But again, just cool proof of concept. Now, this next image looks like a normal train, except it is something that the South wishes it had. This is a designated medical train. If you were injured at the Battle of Richmond and you had your arm blown off, that is not something that can be easily fixed in the field with a high chance of recovery. So you need to go to a hospital, except the closest hospital is 30 miles away. And by the time that you walk there, you've probably bled out. And by the time you get there on a horse, you've either bled out or you have some nasty infection. And there's no planes to get you there fast either. So they put you on this train with about 100 other people, and then they take you to the hospital. And recovery rates start to drastically increase because they get very specialized care a lot faster than beforehand. And this works really well. And then medical trains would be used for pretty much every single war afterwards because they are effective. They're very good. Now, the South never had this because they, one, never had the engines to spare, and the railroads really, really sucked. And a couple other things. They had quote unquote medical trains, but it really wasn't like designated like the Union had. Now, this third one is really fascinating. This is the first time that somebody straps a mortar onto a train. This is the first railway gun. In World War I, you would have railway guns being used by pretty much all nations pretty extensively. And in World War II, there was a couple railway guns as well. But the Civil War sees the first one. This is just an absolute monster of a mortar that's been slapped on this car. And once again, it's more of a proof of concept rather than like a war-changing item. But it's really fascinating to see that like we have trains now, and trains are helpful. How do we kill people with this in the best way possible? And it's because of these inventions that all these other crazy things stem from it. It's really fascinating to look at. So, railways, very important. Yeah. So I hope you guys enjoyed this episode, and I hope to see you guys in the next one. See ya.